Once upon a time, you're just so fine through the bums a dime in your prime.
So, yeah, we're not going to blow anybody's speakers out, let alone our own.
Did you? All right. And then maybe if it doesn't work, I'll just come over and hit the key every now and then. I won't hit every slide, but. Right. The Lord be with you. Good morning to all of you. We have a few technical issues we're trying to work out, but we'll still go forward with what we have here, and that'll be fine. One other housekeeping issue. This is a three-part series on the loyal opposition. But I had a grandson born just a couple of days ago. Thank you. I didn't have much to do with it. But I appreciate the applause anyway. But what that means is he was born in New York City a little bit early, but not so early that he was born in the midst of the snowstorm, fortunately. He waited a day or two before the roads were cleared off. Anyway, all that is to say, next week I will be gone. Lisa and I are going out to New York to see the little guy, and maybe his parents too. So I will not be doing the loyal opposition next week. I think Brad Beach may be filling in. We're still working out how to do that. Then 2 weeks, the 2 weeks after that, the 15th and the 22nd, we'll continue on with the loyal opposition. So my wife was talking to her father this week, and she mentioned that I was doing an adult class on the loyal opposition. My father-in-law, by the way, is a political scientist, so he knows what these things are about, but he was a little surprised. Loyal opposition? In Sunday school, he says, is he going to tie it into the Bible? He's also a good Baptist, you know. So if you're going to have Sunday school, you got to tie it into the Bible. And she assured him that I was, and I think he was satisfied. She says that, you know, he's 87 now. He's not as tactful as he used to be. But I think it's a legitimate question. What are we doing talking about, I mean, what even is the loyal opposition? And what are we doing talking about the loyal opposition? And I do want to say I am going to have biblical connections because I believe there are true biblical, theological, faith connections to what this is all about. So even if you're like my father-in-law and you got that kind of, we got to tie it, be sure you have a Bible verse in there somewhere. That's coming. It's coming later. It also strikes me that I'm a professor and I'm bad at marketing. That's not where my gifts are. I probably should have titled this something other than loyal opposition, which is a strange phrase. But essentially what we're talking about is the principle of the importance in society, at least in the modern world, of allowing peaceful disagreement or peaceful dissent, disagreeing with those who are in power. Or what we sometimes say is the phrase of we need to agree to disagree. And that is important for, of course, politics and government, but I also want to suggest it's also important for us in our daily lives, in all kinds of areas, in terms of thinking about how we're engaging other people with whom we disagree. And so there are principles here that go pretty deep. But it does matter, I think, in a lot of different ways. And to maybe illustrate both what the loyal opposition is, or what happens when you don't have it, and why it matters, I want to tell you a story. Go back to 1992. Many of you know that Elisa and I were missionaries in Kenya. We were teaching at a school for missionary kids. Primarily, that was the purpose. It was largely a boarding school, although it did have some Africans and some other groups in there. But it was sort of this American accredited school in Africa this kind of mixture of American and African kind of cultural things going on. 1992, I was 30 years old teaching social studies, American history and whatever in high school. And this was a boarding school. We were on trimesters, three semesters a year, and the students would come for 3 months, then they'd have a month off. And one day, it was during the break, I remember, and so the students were gone. They had gone back home for their parents, except for those that were on the missionary base there. But anyway, it was the school was quiet in essence. Beautiful day, as it usually was in this spot in Kenya, which is west of Nairobi, about an hour. It's on the side of the rift, Great Rift, at about 6,000 feet above sea level, and most days are sunny and 72 degrees. I remember it was this beautiful day, and we were having lunch. My daughters were preschoolers at that time, 4 years old and 2 and 1, and we're having lunch. Elisa and my daughters were just having a nice lunch on this beautiful day, and in the middle of lunch, we hear this beep, 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 and a car just tears up the drive, honking madly. Lisa and I run out, and out pops another missionary named Jack. And Jack says, "We just got report that men with guns came out of the forest up above, and they attacked the Kajabi Primary School and shot a bunch of people. The missionary men are gathering down at the chapel to figure out what to do." And he hopped in the car and he tore off to tell somebody else. Okay. All right. So I told Lisa, okay, go back inside and lock up. Went down to the chapel. And there were men, I mean, there's gender thing, but that's another story. There were men, the missionary men were gathering around at the chapel trying to figure out, what are we going to do? And then they're talking about, can we get the people, together and in one place, in dorms or whatever, and we're talking about if we have to evacuate. How do we evacuate? We're on the side of the mountain. There's like 3 main roads going up. The Kajabi Primary School was an African primary school up the road about 4 miles. It was up the main road up to the highway to go to Nairobi. And so we're having all this conversation about all this that is going on. And, how are we going to do this? What are we going to... By the way, police... At Kajabi, the police consisted of 2 men down about a mile away in a little shack, and they didn't have a car or guns. If you wanted the police, you had to drive down and get them and bring them back up. So we were largely responsible in many ways, figuring out the times of security. What are we going to do? And as we're talking, there are more people coming in. And a guy came in who had lived in Uganda previous years ago, and when they had some unrest there, and he says, wait a minute. He says, how do we know this is true? How do we know this really did happen? And by the way, the Africans who were working on campus, they were all tearing off to go, head back home, and their kids, is everybody safe? I mean, everybody was sort of in uproar and in a panic. And we said, oh, yeah, how do we know this is true? He says, first thing we ought to do probably is find out if this really did happen. Okay. So a couple people ran off, and we continued conversation. And after a little while, I don't know how long, maybe 10 minutes or so, somebody comes back and says, it didn't happen. Oh, okay. It didn't happen. It was truly fake news. It was truly something that did not happen, that was reported as what happened. And we all breathed a sigh of relief and went back. Now, what is significant about this? Let me mention a few things. First of all, as I look back on it, why did it take us so long to come to ask the question, wait a minute, did this really happen? I mean, if we got a report that men with machine guns came into a primary school in Canton, don't you think we'd come across that question pretty quickly? Like, wait a minute, are you sure? But we were talking for, I don't know, 15 minutes just assuming that this really did happen. And the answer to that question is, we thought it was really quite plausible, because at that point in 1992, Kenya was in the midst of an election season. And there was some tension in the country. And the reason that there was some tension in the country was because up until the previous year, Kenya pretty much only had one political party. It did not have multiple parties. It had one political party. And the founding president, Jomo Kenyatta, had said, we are a nation of 55 different people groups, tribal groups, and so in order to work together as a nation, we should only have one political party. Otherwise, we're going to get into these terrible disagreements with one another. And it actually was enforced by law that you only had one political party. All other parties were illegal. Well, that created its own problems. Mainly the one political party ended up amassing a lot of power, especially to particular people within that party. And I won't get into all the Kenyan history and politics there, but it was kind of a mess, and there were tensions, and people were saying, wait a minute, we want an alternative. And in the year late in the year before this, in late 1991, the government said, okay, because of all these protests and tensions that had built up, we will allow other political parties. But it was still very tense because the political parties did tend to then gravitate to particular people groups, and there were a lot of animosities about some groups that had abused other groups in the past, and there was violence in different parts of the country. And there were people who had died in the violence. We now know maybe at that year about 1,000 people in different places had died. In fact, at one point, I remember our main road going into Nairobi, our leader said, don't go into Nairobi today because it's dangerous, because there are protests on the main highway and they're pulling people out of cars and beating them up. And one person up there had died. In other words, the reason we thought this was plausible was because there was a fair amount of unrest at that particular moment in Kenya. By the way, the other thing we found out the next day, you want to really talk about fake news, is that the same rumor had broken out at the same time at about 24 different places around the central province in this one area of the country. Somebody was deliberately planting that story, I think for political reasons. My guess is the ruling government was doing it to make people feel that there's unease and unrest in the country, and it was a lot better when there was just one political party running everything. Like I said, fake news. The other reason we thought it was plausible was because East Africa, these are countries that had gotten their independence just 20, 30 years before this. And there was instability in a number of other places too. At that time, there was a civil war in Somalia that borders Kenya. Ethiopia had a civil war in the 1970s. A new civil war had broken out in the Sudan. There's still some problems going on there. Uganda had in essence, a civil war in the 1970s. You go beyond Uganda to what was then Zaire, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. They had a civil war also. This was also, by the way, just 2 years before the Rwanda genocide. So there was reason to, and we knew missionaries who had to evacuate from Zaire. I knew missionaries that had to evacuate from Liberia over in West Africa. It was plausible that the whole, basically, social and political system would collapse and fall into civil war, which is really not a good thing. when we are somewhere along the line here before one of our semesters, the teachers would get together for in-service and you'd go over policies for the upcoming semester before the classes began. And in schools today we have fire drills and we have tornado drills, and now we have single person shooter drills and so forth. We, as part of our security, all got up in the, we were in the middle of the meeting, so okay, we're all going to go. We went to a girls' dormitory and we said, if things should fall apart, we figured out we can gather all the teachers and staff and students, and we can put the 15 in a room temporarily, and we'll put men on one end of the hallway at one doorway and one on the other end of the hallway at the other doorway, and we'll wait here for the U.S. helicopters to land on the soccer field. And that's our evacuation plan. We had to have an evacuation plan with the U.S. Embassy. Years later, by the way, I had a student in class, a non-traditional student who had been a Marine, and I was talking to him, and he explained he had we figured out he was actually on an aircraft carrier at that moment in the Indian Ocean. And he would have been one of the guys that came and evacuated us. As it turned out, we didn't need it. It was a time of unrest. Kenya got through that. They had some other blips in the years after that, but the country did not fall apart. But it could have. And I can remember thinking, during those times of instability, like just thinking, what would it mean for the entire society to fall apart? And I had never felt that before in my life. I never felt that in the United States. And I went, after the election was over and things had calmed down, I remember being at an event in Nairobi, and the American ambassador to Kenya spoke. And he was speaking about the election, the political situation. He says, the problem in Kenya is they do not have a tradition of the loyal opposition. I thought, a tradition of the loyal opposition. Now, loyal opposition is not a phrase we use, but it is a component of modern democratic governments, if you will, and it's an important one. It's most clearly seen in Great Britain. If you want to hit the next slide, is it going to change here? In Great Britain, they actually, on the left here, you have the current prime minister and his cabinet members, but by law, in Great Britain, now this is really very interesting, by law, the opposing party, the minority party that is out of power, has a person, the head of their minority party, who is called His Majesty's Loyal Opposition, or in the days of Elizabeth, Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. And that person is actually given an office and a staff, and I think a car maybe even, and has people in his or her party who form what's called a shadow cabinet, where each one has a position that matches up with an existing cabinet. So you've got like the Minister of Finance, and they've got a shadow Minister of Finance. You got the Minister of Foreign Affairs, you got a shadow Minister of Foreign Affairs. And the job of the loyal opposition is actually to oppose the party in power. Like, that is their job. It's officially written into law in Great Britain. And in fact, not only is it their job, but they are expected in Parliament, because of the way things work, the Prime Minister is a member of Parliament. In Parliament, they are expected to get up and challenge the existing Prime Minister. And in fact, they have times and dates when they have regular time every week where that is officially set aside for this. Wednesdays at noon. It's PMQ, Prime Minister Questions, and if you go to London, you can get tickets and watch if you are a real political junkie. Or if you're a real political junkie and you don't want to spend the money, you can go on YouTube and watch PMQ time every Wednesday at noon, where the opposition will stand up and they'll question the Prime Minister and his or her cabinet on particular sort of things. And the British say, You know, this is part of their system. It's important that you have somebody who is there to challenge, to question, to speak out, to dissent from the existing political party. That is where we get that idea of the loyal opposition. Now, for our purposes here, I'm not so much interested, we're going to talk about this, not so much interested in the structures and the institutions and the policies for how that works out, although that's important. I'm more interested in the underlying principles behind this. Because one thing about the loyal opposition is there's, at least in the United States, and we have elements of this even though we don't use the term and we don't have, you know, Wednesdays at noon, challenge the president sort of thing on, you know, in Parliament or in Congress on TV and that sort of thing. We still have elements of this kind of thing. And there's kind of a take for granted aspect of it. The word that the U.S. ambassador used was they don't have the tradition. In other words, it has to be kind of a habit or a practice that we as a society undertake. And it has to be a belief. And part of the belief is this: political opponents are not traitors. I mean, not necessarily. It's possible they could be traitors. But just because they're opposing the government, you are not a traitor. You are not an enemy of the state. And dissent, disagreeing with the government, is not only legitimate, it's important. We actually need to have that. And I would argue having the freedom to disagree is important, not just for government. It's important for about any institution that we have. Yes?
Can you speak, as you're doing this, can you speak on the word loyal then?
Ah ha ha.
What are you loyal to?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. In fact, I love this. We're on some sort of wave of the Holy Spirit, because that's my next point here. I don't know if that's... So what is the loyal part? What are you loyal to? Because the loyal opposition essentially says you are loyal to something, but it's not a person and it's not a party that you're loyal to. But you are loyal to something. And here's where we get, I think, into some very important theological point. You're not loyal to people. You're loyal to a higher principle, a higher set of principles. And it can be embodied in the Constitution. It could be embodied in some other sort of document. As Christians, we would say our ultimate loyalty is to God, not to... I mean, there are biblical verses of this. Do not put your trust in princes. but I think best worked out by Augustine. So you've been doing Augustine in his City of God, where he says, there's a reason and there's a purpose for government. And we need to have a certain amount of loyalty to that government, but not ultimate loyalty. That's the city of man. Government and other human institutions are the city of man. Our ultimate loyalty is to the city of God. And in this way, the loyal opposition, I think, actually reflects, and in many ways was formed, I think sometimes unintentionally, off of Christian principles. And actually, I think it's in some ways, and I don't know, there just hasn't been that much history on the history of this concept, but it seems to me it's influenced by Augustine's idea in the city of God, that there's some ultimate higher principle that we are loyal to. So you can be loyal to that, and you can oppose the government. Why? Because what is government made up of? People. Doggone it. And you know what people are like. Yeah. As Jerry Seinfeld says, people, they're the worst. That's a bit extreme, huh? People are also good. We're created by God and so forth. So, yes, thank you, Dan, for that very, very good point. We have this principle, and it's sort of a taken for granted principle in what we do, but I think, especially in times of polarization like we're in right now, it would be very good if we are much more explicit about some of these principles, that actually disagreement and dissent, not only, by the way, our freedom to disagree with somebody else is in power. But if we are loyal to or part of the people who are in party power, accepting the fact people might disagree with us, that's actually a necessary and I would say a healthy part of modern democracy. And it's not just our politicians that need this. This is a democracy. We're the ones that elect our politicians. We get what we vote for. And so the people themselves need to have a healthy sense of the importance to agree to disagree, the importance of recognizing that dissent is there, the importance of recognizing that if somebody disagrees with the government in power, that doesn't make them a traitor. They're not treasonous necessarily. There are some traitors out there. Actually, later on we're going to talk about people. What about people who do not believe in democracy? We'll get to that in the third week. But I think sometimes there's a tendency to think, well, the will of the people. What do the people say? And that ultimately, united we stand, divided we fall. And if our backs will ever be against the wall, we'll be, the old 70s song. That we will all agree. And that disagreement, it's like a good marriage, right? You never disagree. Lisa and I haven't disagreed since September 4th, 1986. Right? Oh, she's going to disagree with me. What do you know? Yes, the point is not that we don't ever disagree, but there are good ways of disagreeing. There are healthy ways of disagreeing. There are unhealthy ways of disagreeing. But the point is, how do you work out your disagreements? What do you do when you are disagreeing? And what do you do when, this is where it really gets tricky, somebody may actually be wrong. I mean, like really wrong, like in a bad way. That's our challenge. And it's like I said, that's a challenge not just for government, it's a challenge for a lot of different things. I want to say one other thing. I'm convinced it's not natural. The loyal opposition is not something we naturally gravitate towards. The opposite is that, somebody disagrees, they're wrong, and they need to be silenced. That's probably that's the first impulse. That's the default mode for human beings. Loyal opposition is something we have to learn. It's something we have to learn, and we need to teach, and we need to strengthen, and we need to constantly maintain. And in that way, it is a type of virtue. Remember we talked about virtues. Virtues, the good things you do, but you habitually do them. You build them in so that you just naturally do. So if the loyal opposition is, the idea of the loyal opposition is a virtue, and I'm sure it is, then it's tied to biblical principles. And the reason it's not natural is that here's our natural impulse. We turn to this scripture, right? Their natural impulse is we don't always see things clearly. We always want to see things the way we want to see them, right? So Jesus says this, why do you see the speck that in your brother's eye, but you do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye, you hypocrite? First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. We don't see clearly. The way we tend to see things is the way we want them to be. That's a big tendency we have. And what we want is to make ourselves feel right and superior and good and so forth. We even do this unconsciously, by the way. All kinds of, they're called unconscious biases. And there's all kinds of self-serving unconscious biases that we have. In other words, if human beings cannot see things clearly, you need somebody else to say, hey, wait a minute. What about this? We need to be held accountable. And that's a key part of the loyal opposition. And this, I think, is some of the scriptural backing to it. But let me go a little bit further with this and turn to another piece of Scripture from Luke 9. And this is what I'll call the Zebedee option, taken from Eugene Peterson, who talks about the Zebedee brothers, James and John. So Jesus, well, there's just this little passage in Luke 9. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he sent his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent his messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" Now, by the way, dark humor. I mean, this is pretty nasty stuff here. And I think whenever I've read this for years and years, my reaction is, my gosh, James and John, that is really out of line. I mean, come on. You're going to destroy a Samaritan village? Boy, that's really pretty bad. And it is. But I might be a little too quick to judge. Because here's, as I'm older, I've sort of come to this conclusion. We ought to be able to see even a little bit of ourselves in every person we encounter in Scripture. The good and the bad. This is a bad part. We can go to another verse, and John and James looking good. We should see ourselves in there too with Christ. Wait a minute. Is there a part of us in what James and John are saying? Well, let's think about this. This is how I think about this to get this way. If we get into their heads, let's think about the historical context here. This is at the end of Jesus' ministry. He's been ministering for 3 years. He's had the disciples with him for 3 years. This is right towards the end. He's setting his face towards Jerusalem. He's heading towards the cross. And the disciples, James and John, the Zebedee brothers, have seen amazing, mind-blowing things from Jesus. He has healed the sick. He has given sight to the blind. He has raised people from the dead, for Pete's sake. He's opened people to the eyes of Scripture. He has taught with authority and helped people to see things they've never seen before. People are forgiven. They've been given hope. They've been given joy. You've got all kinds of outsiders who suddenly lives have been transformed. James and John have been a part of that. Not only that, if you go back to just a few verses before this, at the beginning of Luke 9, Jesus gave the disciples power and authority to go out to the villages. And he said, "I am giving you power over demons," which we're like, wow, what is that? I don't know, but that's pretty amazing, whatever that is. And the ability to miraculously heal people and to proclaim the kingdom of heaven. And the disciples went out. So James and John have gone out without Jesus, and they've been a part of this amazing ministry. And they've got this amazing sort of spiritual connection and power that within themselves, and Jesus has given that to them, right? Now, oh, by the way, and right before this, the Transfiguration, which is, we had Transfiguration a couple of Sundays ago, and I'm still wrapping my mind around what in the world was that? What was going on there? James and John, with Peter, were there. They were the 3 people who witnessed that. Like they had this special privilege to see some truly mind-blowing event. And they're realizing now, Peter has, in a meeting right before this, has testified, "You are the Christ." It is clear. This is the Messiah. This is the event that is going to transform and change the world, and we're right in the middle of it. We are disciples. We've been given authority. So now Jesus says, the key event now, I'm heading to Jerusalem. Now, on a map, if you can hit one more, you may know this. They're up in Galilee. They have to go south to Jerusalem. But to get to Jerusalem, they have to go through Samaria. Those Samaritans. And the Samaritans are, the Jews and the Samaritans, man, they're not getting along. Samaritans don't like the Jews don't like the Samaritans in general. The Jews look at Samaritans. Samaritans historically were people who were a mix between kind of the pagan people of the area who'd intermarried with some of the remnant that hadn't gone off to Babylon. So there's a little bit of Judaism in them, and then it's like they've distorted. They've taken the Word of God and completely messed it up and distorted. They have their own temple. And they think that the temple in Jerusalem is false. And, the Jews are like, well, your temple, you're not worshiping God. And there's tensions between these groups. And so now Jesus has to go through, well, if you're going to take the shortest route, you go through Samaria to get to Jerusalem. And so he says, go and find, get a village for me. And they go out and they find the Samaritan village. Says, we're not letting you through here. You're going to Jerusalem? That is not the right place. No. And the reaction of, the Zebedee brothers is, Samaritans. Isn't that just like them? And because what we are doing here is world changing. Right? We as Christians say, Jesus is going to the cross. That is the most important event in the history of the world. And the Samaritans are blocking our way and they're halting us. They are trying to prevent God's will from being done. Now here's the thing. On that part, they're right. I mean, it's not just that Samaritans are a little bit, like, oh gosh, I didn't realize that. I'm sorry, you're going to change the world. No, like the Samaritans are opposed to whoever this crazy prophet is, Jesus. They are putting up an obstacle in the way of the gospel. James and John are on the right side. Do you want us to call down? You've given us authority. Do you want us to call down fire? Well, what is calling down fire? If you want to hit the next slide for me. You know what it is? It's a way of removing your opponents, or punishing your opponents, or silencing your opponents, or trying to gain power over your opponents. Because the Samaritans, at least that village, they are opponents. They're stopping. They're blocking the way. And so, okay. Yeah. Now I can see a little more of myself in the Zebedee brothers. Like people, it can be for really good things. Sometimes, it's out of sinful reasons, but sometimes out of really good people. These people are promoting things that are unjust. These people are promoting things that are not good. Can't we just silence them? If we would just get power over them, we could set things all right. Well, now things are getting more tricky. Because the Zebedee brothers are actually on the right side. Samaritans are an obstacle here. But there's a problem here. What's the problem? The problem is that, so the solution is get rid of the opponents. And here's another thing. You and I think, are probably not going to ask God to call down fire upon whoever it is that we're mad upon. I have faith that you are not doing that. However, you and I probably within us have been so mad sometimes that we're like, can't these people just, be silenced? And in other words, within us we have this little seed that is like the Zebedee option seed within us. And Jesus said that as much, right? In the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not kill. And whoever kills is liable to judgment. If you kill, you're going to be judged for that. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. That's a hard verse. Whoever is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. And that's difficult because there is true kind of righteous anger, but boy, there's also a type of anger that is not good. Whoever insults his brother is liable to the council. Whoever says, you fool, is liable to the hell of fire. I myself have a problem of being snarky about people. That's a way of saying they are fools. It makes me liable to the hell of fire. Oh, gosh, if I'm taking Jesus seriously. So there is a seed there. What does Jesus do? We can go to the next one. Jesus hears this, and he turns. One more, two more actually, bink, bink. And he rebukes them. Now what's interesting is that he turns. That's interesting to me. Like, I don't know, I imagine they're walking along, and they're saying, and they're just talking, and then he kind of like stops and turns on them. That's what I imagine. And then he rebukes them. Boy, what would it be like to be rebuked by Jesus? Face to face. We've probably been rebuked, but we haven't had to endure the face-to-face part of it. How does he do it? Luke doesn't tell us what Jesus says. He just says Jesus rebuked him. But there's a point here. There's a point here that Jesus makes. And hit the next little arrow for me, Kate, if you want to, or something. Eugene Peterson puts it this way. He says, Christ followers don't bash people who are not on our side, either physically or verbally. That's what Jesus is saying. That's our standard. We should not bash others, opponents, verbally or physically. Now, we can oppose them, and we should oppose them. But bashing is out. And I think that's a message that a lot of us need to hear today, Christians and non-Christians in our own. It's certainly a message I need to hear. Jesus doesn't bash. He rebukes the disciples, and what does he do? He just goes on to another town. Oh, yeah, you could do that. Just go another way. Probably has to go a longer way around. Take a longer trip. It'll take more days to get to Jerusalem. It's a little bit harder. But we're not here. Because you know what? Yeah, the Samaritans are opposed to the gospel. God knows that. You know, like, should we call on God? God, do you see what they're doing? Yeah, he knows that. That's the whole point Jesus has come into the world, right? It's because we've got this brokenness and fallenness that needs to be taken care of. And Jesus is not going to fall into what the Zebedee brothers has done. It actually fits with something Pastor Ben said last week when he was talking about Jesus being templed by the devil in the wilderness. It says Jesus refuses to be a tool. I'm not going to be used for your political purposes. He refuses to be the tool of our anxieties, you know. He's the potter, we are the clay. But let's remember this also. The rebuke does not nullify all the great and wonderful things that the Zebedee brothers have done up to this point. It doesn't nullify their ministry, the good they have done up to this point. It doesn't take away their authority, their presence at the transfiguration, because that's who God is too, right? This is a God who forgives us, and it doesn't surprise him when we are not acting the way we are supposed to do. So we say regularly, forgive us our debts. Lord, have mercy.
But Jesus doesn't do nothing.
Exactly.
He confronts, he
Yes.
engages.
That's right.
And he calls God's word down.
That's right.
And so that's the thing that I'm not going to attack physically.
Right.
Ask you the question that you don't want to answer.
This is a very good point, because the solution is not to be passive. We still have, and the Zebedee brothers are not going to be passive after this. They're still going to be active, but it's not going to be in bashing other people. either verbally or physically. You're going to be active. It may be in confronting people. And this is where things get really, really difficult. Sometimes and I'm no good at this. Sometimes you need to confront somebody when something's going bad and bring something to light. But there's a way to do it right without bashing them or demeaning them. Or there's a way of not confronting people and silencing them without confronting them. Because you still have, and so in the next couple of lessons we'll get into this a little bit more. But I think there's a principle here that we have to understand, that there's a good way to disagree, and it doesn't involve physical or verbal bashing. But it might, and it should probably involve some sort of confrontation and difficult conversations, really is what it comes down to. Difficult conversations, not difficult name calling, which sometimes is less difficult than a conversation. And that's us individually. See, there's individual implications for this, and then there's also big social implications for this and political implications of this. Our system, when it has run well, and I think it does run well a lot of times, given, human beings, has a lot of these principles built into it. So if we could go on and look at ways that in the American system there are things we already have that I think we need to maintain, and we need to continue to figure out how we're going to live these out as Christians, right? First of all, we need to realize that political competition and disagreement is not only okay, it's probably good. And it's good because, I go back to Kenya, if you don't have that other political party opposing the government, then the government is going to be able to move without anybody holding it accountable. And that's what happened in Kenya, and there were some terrible abusive things that the government was doing, and that's a whole other story that I could get into. We do not want a one-party state. Whatever political party you identify with, you should also offer up thanks for the opposing political party. Because we need to live in a society when we are going to be challenging one another. If you think about, the loyal opposition in Britain getting up and the difficult sort of thing. Now, we need to do it well, but it needs to be there. Other things that we have but we do it peacefully, not by force. We're not going to bash. We're going to work things out peacefully. This is really what democracy is. That we're going to have a disagreement, and we're going to try to work it out through political means, not turning to the military, not grabbing the guns, not turning to a lynch mob, whatever it might be. Another point, that means the military should be kept separate from politics. And the founders very early on were suspicious of a big military. We had that experience with George III and British troops in Boston and many other places, and how there were abuses there, and you couldn't, especially if you were a poor person in Boston, as an example, I could get into a bunch of stories there, but you could get abused by soldiers and you had no recourse. But more importantly, that very often, and this is what a lot of the founders were, tyrants use the military to enforce their will and silence people who are opposed to them. So how do you run a government? You have military, but you got to keep it separate from politics. That's an important point. Other principle. Losers have to be confident that they're not going to be harmed. It could be that you're in power, you lose an election. We have to be confident that they're not going to go after you then. Now that I'm in power, let's take it to this guy. I can give you some really extreme examples in Africa that are really bad, but we'll move on from that. Related to that, the next point is that we need to recognize that losers and minority groups have an important role. That actually speaking up and dissenting is an important role. And they should not be silenced when we have that Zebedee impulse, to silence them. No, they are an important part. That's very specifically played out in the British system. Next point, you're going to have a transfer of power. Transfer of power has to be done peacefully. This is something we take for granted, because most times in American history, the vast majority of times, but not every time, the transfer of power has been peaceful. I'm thinking not just on federal level, but on state and local levels and so forth. And we take that for granted, and we should not. I'm going to get into this more in the next time. And then there are some specific things that actually are built into our Constitution that are built in for particular reasons. They aren't like they're necessarily with a loyal opposition in mind, but they imply a loyal opposition. One of them is the freedom of religion, the right to assembly, the right to petition. Like, the right to petition, that means you have the right to complain. It's in the Constitution. You have the right to complain. You have the right to assemble, which also we have understood to mean protest. That is a First Amendment right. We have the right to protest. That is a way of, actually I think it's a very American patriotic thing. And then the freedom of religion, I'm going to talk about this next week, or the next time I have, 2 weeks from now. This is also, I think, a critical sort of component of the other thing. We can disagree with people we disagree with theologically. If we can get along with them, even when we disagree on some really important things, then we ought to be able to do it with political things. Other things that are built in, and freedom of press, freedom of speech, of course, that's also in the First Amendment, but I wanted to put that out as a separate kind of point. How very important this is and how we need to protect freedom of speech even among those who are saying some really bad things. Okay, there are, like that Samaritan village, people who will oppose what is good. Yes, but we need to let them speak. You do not silence them. And that can come in a lot of silencing can come in a lot of different forms. Thirdly, checks and balances sort of imply a loyal opposition, maybe not in terms of political parties, but the Congress sometimes will be opposed by the president. The president says, I'm not going to sign that bill. Likewise, the president will sometimes be opposed by Congress, who says, no, this is our job. And of course, you got the judicial Supreme Court, who sometimes will rule that each one or the other is unconstitutional. It's great that they are separate and that you've got checks and balances. That it has built into it this idea that not everybody is going to be on the same page, and you want to be sure that one group doesn't get more power, too much power, or get too abusive. Some other points. Something similar to that, federal power, state power, that's built into, sort of like reviewing 8th grade civics here. But in light of this, we need to be reminded of these kinds of things, right? There's some things that, no, that's the job of the state. No, that's the job of the federal government. And they shouldn't, that gets complicated. They shouldn't be overlapping too much. And an independent judiciary, I'd say this is really, really important. If you look at abusive nations around the world, every nation has a judicial system. But the most abusive ones are those that are lined up with a strong executive and pretty much walk lockstep with them. That's what was happening in Kenya. Here's the thing about Kenya during that time. They had elections. They had a constitution. American justices helped Kenya write its constitution. They had an executive. They had a legislative. They had a judiciary. They had newspapers. How come they weren't a free and open democracy? You've got the institutions, but you've got to have the practices underneath all of that. And I'd say, so part of that is that we've got to allow people freedom to be wrong. We got to resolve our differences, or at least some will not be resolved. We've got to work through our differences peacefully. Now, it gets tricky, of course, but I just wanted to go back to what I think is a fundamental point. For the next 2 sessions, we'll get into some other questions related to this. But last few minutes here, questions or comments. We've already had some excellent ones. How about some more from you? Or observations? Yeah,
I agree with everything that you said here.
Well, that's no good. You're supposed to disagree.
But we seem to be today so far away from everything you said.
Well, it does seem like we are far away from everything.
I'm reading a book about virtues of 7 presidents. One that's written by the head of the which really at that time that he did it was opposed to what the American people thought. But he wanted to heal the country. So he thought we need to do this for healing. And he went to Tip O'Neill, who was his friend at that time, because they worked together. And O'Neill says, well, you're going to lose the 76 election. 1976. And he did. But guess who eulogized Gerald Ford? Jimmy Carter. So you had this working together at that time. Can you imagine that happening today?
You know, the working together across political parties, and there are studies that have shown that in the last 40 or 50 years, they are working together a lot less. Now, I will say there are politicians out there who are and who do it. We have some Malone graduates that sometimes we take Malone students to Washington, D.C., and we meet some Malone graduates who have worked with congressmen or in departments. And they will often say, there are a lot of politicians who will get up in public and bash their opponent, but then behind the scenes, they're working together on a number of things and are actually not so big of enemies. And part of the problem, though, is they bash, and this comes back to us, they bash their opponents because this is what American people are drawn to, is simplistic, you know, they're the enemies, we're the good guys kinds of things. So you're right that I think we have some really unhealthy things going on right now. I'm undecided on this. It may not, like how unhealthy, some of it is still going on. There's a long tradition there. And I will say, I can look at, like I said, I have Kenya's example, and I can think of Latin American governments and other things through history. We're still not at the point of really, really, really bad governments. But it's something we need to be mindful of and figure out, okay, what do we do about it? And I want to get into the next couple of weeks, not just, you know, like, are we going to change Washington, D.C.? No. Like, you know, whatever, the 12 of us here. No, but there are things that we do in our daily lives that even involve how we have conversations with other people and what we say and how we talk about them, that can be the long, slow, hard work of reinforcing these good principles underneath it. Because we do have a lot of really unhealthy things going on. And part of the goal is to identify, this is unhealthy, this is healthy. And quite frankly, if I've got a candidate in my party who may even be standing for the right things, but is doing them in unhealthy ways, I need to think about whether that's a good move or not, to vote for this person.
I think when you were talking about people are working together, but that does not sell newspapers.
Right.
We get a lot of information.
Right.
Just,
Yeah.
To take it for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Trying to sell you something.
Right. So the problem of selling newspapers, newspapers, the media in our society is market driven. It doesn't have to be market driven, but it is. That's what we have. And what sells, you know, blood sells. What's the phrase that editors use? If it bleeds, it leads. Yes, that's much. Yes, that's the phrase. Much more pithy than blood sells. If it bleeds, it leads. We as Americans, we're drawn for some reason to drama, to things that make us angry, things that make us fascinated about somebody else's misfortune, to things that scare us. We're not often drawn to the really kind of hard work of, oh, wait a minute, let's stop and reflect. When was the last time you had a newspaper headline that says, stop and think about this? And that's a problem. It's an important role for the media, and I think one of the problems is our media is now so fragmented that actually gives more power to, and then algorithms on social media and so forth draw people to the extremes and draw them more towards the things that make them angry or make them scared. And that's an unhealthy thing. And so that's another thing that we need to figure out. By the way, one step I think is very good is I like Mike DeWine's act of banning cell phones among high school students. so that you're just not, that's a habit. That's you know, and I would say a vice to have your cell phone all the time, which is more likely to drive you to, if you're looking at the news, social media, which is more often fake news, which is more often distorted, not all the time, but a lot of times distorted, and are more often stirring up your, what kind of media do we consume? And that's a choice we need to think about. How do we consume media when we're getting our news and getting our sense of what is going on out there? Kate.
I was just thinking about like the British practice of having the opposition regular time of talking, and like that is a different type of mindset, right? Because like I feel like a lot of our opposition is in reaction. It's
Yeah.
a different part of your brain, literally, like the prefrontal cortex, you know, sort of
Yeah.
you're in battle mode, like sort of thing. Versus if you have a planned time where you know you're going to be talking about it, it's a different place in your brain. You're actually thinking about it.
Yeah.
And you can maybe see the other side a little more.
Right. That's an interesting place. If you heard what Kate was saying, and maybe for the people at home, I'll repeat, the British system of where you're right in that place and you're going back and forth using a different part of your brain than where we often in the media just react to. So that's important for government officials. I think if we were to watch, now I will say, sometimes PMQs get really, really nasty. And they are bashing each other verbally, okay. But nevertheless, they're just the presence of, oh, this is the time of day. You know, like the president just doesn't get to say, I will only choose to ask, you know, whichever, you know, whoever. We have a little bit of that in press conference, but there have been presidents who have said things like, I don't want to listen to these people. You are no longer allowed in. You know, no, let's ask some hard questions. But then also for us, and I want to get into this in the next couple of weeks, for those of us who are not politicians, can we have hard conversations with people who disagree with us? You know, it's one thing to see the President of the United States getting up there and getting grilled. But most of it, we're reading media and reacting to it, right, in that way. And I'm including myself in this because I am a conflict avoider. I do not want to have hard conversations. I'd rather get up in like this situation where I'm controlling the conversation. And I'll let you have a few questions there and then I can still manipulate it the way I want to. That's how I like it. I don't like to sit down and really have a hard conversation with somebody I disagree with. That's hard. But maybe that's one thing that we need to learn how to do, not just on politics. Like I said, sometimes, look, in interpersonal relationships, sometimes there are things in your family, just on family matters, you have to sit down and have a hard conversation about. I mean, this goes to a lot of things, and that's a wonderful point, Kate. We are using a different part of our brain when we're like wanting to have a back and forth rather than just reacting to something somebody says. Either we agree with it, yay! A lot of politics today is like cheering for your football team. Yes, that's our side, beat them. Oh no, we got hit, fight back. And no, wait a minute. Let's go for illumination rather than ammunition, is what we're there.
Well, this may be a Bible passage you'll come to yet, so I don't mean to take away from it. But when it struck me that Proverbs 27:17 brings out this loyal opposition thing. The verse says, like iron sharpens iron,
yeah.
so does one friend, loyal, one friend, sharpen the character of another friend.
This is a great point, and there are a lot of proverbs that actually do speak to this very kind of thing. The iron sharpens iron with friends is good. You know, I mean, it's like there's a grinding that kind of goes on when the iron is up against the iron. But there's also other things about princes who need to listen to wise counsel, and even Proverbs. I have to think about Proverbs. If it throws some of those in the future. All right, I have to go sing. But thank you very much for your comments. Thinking about those things. Next week will be something else. I'm not sure what. But we'll be back in the loyal opposition 2 weeks from now. So, God bless you. Look for hard conversations. Well, we'll talk about hard conversations. If you want to have some hard conversations over the next 2 weeks, go right ahead. That may be a good thing.